And so in order for us to be healthy and to get what we need to eat produce that's healthy and fresh and that has all the nutrients in it that our body needs. So that alone makes it worth it for me to try to grow as much as I can in my garden, because why would I not, right?
Yeah, and this is why we see people saying, oh, well, I know a lot of very sickly plant-based people. Well, that's because the food we're eating is poor. And people who eat meat, they're getting it secondhand, but the grass that the cows are getting is better than the food that we're eating from the store. So it's quite shocking, but when we grow our own food, then we can ensure that this is not the case.
Right.
When you have really hard ground, there is no oxygen. The life in the soil is really poor, so you need to break it up. You need to be able to get the water and the oxygen, everything into there, so that things can start to live. So once you've broken up your ground, then you can prepare it. And we have some examples here of different amendments that you can use on your ground. Today, we are going to talk about soil health. And this is quite a broad topic, but we're going to try and break it down into the simplest form that we can. Timon has taken everybody on a tour yesterday. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit how that went.
Yeah, the tour was actually really good yesterday. We were able to see the greenhouses and the field and a lot of the crops that are growing out there right now. We actually got quite a few questions, and we were able to give quite a few answers as well, which was awesome. And it was a real blessing to just see how God lets everything grow out there, and how even though our season started very late this year with cold and wet spring, we are still able to get a pretty good harvest coming on here. So it was very exciting. We didn't see everything, but I think we saw a pretty good part of it. So yeah, that's kind of where that went.
Good, and we added some pictures in the slides too for those people online and for some of the things that maybe we didn't get to cover in the
That's right,
tour.
yeah.
So we're going to start with a quote. Country Living, page 9 and 10. The time is fast coming when the controlling power of the labor unions will be very oppressive. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country where they can raise their own provisions, for in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. So, talking about raising your own provisions, here are some examples of different provisions that it might be. We have some corn, we have some zucchinis, we have some onions, and then in the middle we have some honeybees that you can have honey, or you can use the beeswax, and they also will help to pollinate your garden, make everything grow nicely. Testimonies, Volume 5, page 152. Can we be surprised if they are not prospered? If God does not bless their crops and they are disappointed, could our brethren remember that God can bless 20 acres of land and make them as productive as 100? So that's a good promise.
Yeah, that is pretty awesome. I don't know how much of you have grown bigger quantities of produce or food, but when you have lots of land that you need to take care of, sometimes when the weeds take over and you run out of time or you don't have enough hands to help, it can be quite challenging. But to know that God can bless even a smaller amount and make it enough for you to last and for the people to last that you are helping, then that's a really good promise. Here we have another quote from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 6, on page 178. And it says, "If the land is cultivated, it will, with the blessing of God, supply our necessities. We are not to be discouraged about temporal things because of apparent failures, nor should we be disheartened by delay. We should work the soil cheerfully, hopefully, gratefully, and believing that the earth holds in her bosom rich stores for the faithful worker to garner, stores richer than gold or silver." So if the land is cultivated and we ask the Lord for his blessing and we trust that he will bless it, and he will, then it will supply what we need. Even though we might not see that right when we start the garden, even though we might have bad weather come at us or just other challenges that make it like we're not going to have anything to eat.
So it doesn't always go perfect?
Well, I mean, there's probably no year where everything goes perfect, I would say. I don't know about you, but...
we're still on planet Earth.
Right. And so with God's help, it's possible. Without his help, I think it's pretty easy to give up halfway through the season. I'd say it that way. There's another really good quote in the Health Food Ministry, page 39, and it says, "I have been shown that study in agricultural lines should be the A, B, and C of the educational work of our school. This institution must not depend upon imported produce for the fruits so essential to healthfulness and for the grains and vegetables. This is the very first work that should be entered upon." So it's not just something we should kind of learn at the end of our day if we have time. It's something that's very crucial for us to learn and to study. And that brings me back to something I mentioned yesterday on our tour. I said, you have to take time to study your soil, to study your garden, your climate, all the conditions that play into it. And you also have to do lots of trials. Try out different varieties, different types of plants, see what grows well, and see what fits your needs and your wishes and your taste the best, right? And that way you can actually get out of the garden what's useful for you, right? There's one other one here from Adventist Home on page 142 and 143, and I'll just read the highlighted parts. And it says, "The special needs of every variety of plant must be studied. Different varieties require different soil and cultivation." And then it says further down that not even the root fiber shall be crowded or misplaced. So it takes care to get plants to grow. And once you start them from seed and you transplant them and you prune them and you do whatever they need, it takes care. It's not just something you can do according to book. Like, it will take actual, you have to invest in it. You have to actually take your heart and go there and do the part you can do. I'll let you read this one.
I'll read the last quote here.
Yeah.
It's from Adventist Home. It's a continuation. It says, "The shielding from frost at night and sun by day, keeping out weeds, disease, and insect pests, the training and arranging," and I'll skip to the bottom, "the constant contact with the mystery of life and the loveliness of nature, as well as the tenderness called forth in ministering to these beautiful objects of God's creation, tends to quicken the mind and refine and elevate the character." So this isn't only about food and about things that will sustain our life, but it also helps us with our character development, because we have to have patience, we have to have perseverance, we have to be nurturing to these plants instead of just giving up and letting them die.
Right. And there's a lot of observation that goes into it that can really help you find what's causing different problems and see what you can do better. And oftentimes I like to do little trials where I just change one little thing. They were seeded the same day, they get the same water, but I change one little thing here or there and I see, okay, how do they perform different? And all these things, they actually help us too to learn and to grow and to, just like you said, get more patience and really bring our mind into what God wants to teach us there.
So the next thing we're going to talk about is till the soil. This is a big topic.
Yes.
There's a lot of talk about no-till. There's some videos that were put out saying that it was God's method, that we should never touch the soil at all. But we know from the Bible that, and we're going to read some of those quotes, that we need to be tilling the soil. We need to be opening up the ground.
Right.
And here's a couple pictures of some methods that you can use. We have in the top left a big tractor tiller. On the bottom we have a little, just a hand rototiller that you can drive. And then a no-power tiller for when we can't buy or sell and we have no gas, that we can just push through our rows. And then we have the compost turner. Now some of these equipment are bigger than most people would have, but it's an assortment just for the examples. So this is Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 368. The plow was only put in the depth of a few inches. The ground was not prepared for the seed, and the harvest was meager, corresponding to the superficial preparation that was given to the land. So here she's saying we need to be preparing the ground properly. And that doesn't mean going through with the tiller every single day,
Right.
and ripping everything up. That's overkill. There's a balance always.
Right.
So this is a picture before and after of what AD's garden used to look like. So God put us in a place that I think was to be an example for everybody, that even if you're given the worst piece of land imaginable, that God can still make something grow. So we have the big rocks. Some of those rocks are bigger than our heads. They were huge rocks that were in the ground. And when we went through and tried to open the ground, it was so hard. We could barely break through. And then once we did, we found that we should have been growing rocks instead of vegetables. And thankfully, now you can see when you went on the tour that we were actually able to grow some veggies, and we'll show some more pictures of the veggies we had in some of the previous years as well. This is from Christ Object Lessons, page 88.
So the soil will not produce its riches when worked by impulse. It needs thoughtful, daily attention. None need stand in the field amid the sad wreck of their hopes. Sometimes we try to do a little bit here and there, and we think, oh, we did pretty good, and then it doesn't turn out, and we're like, oh, this whole garden thing, that doesn't work, and then we're all sad. But if we follow God's principles, and if we do our part and take our time daily and pay attention to what needs to be done, and keep the weeds down, water it when it's necessary, and work the soil so it's good for the plants to grow, then we will actually see a good harvest to come from that.
So the next thing is to prepare the soil. And this may seem similar to working up the soil, but this goes a little bit farther to what the needs of the plant are. First, we have to break up the ground.
Right.
Especially, let's go back to the no-till concept. When you have really hard ground, there is no oxygen. Mm-hmm. The life in the soil is really poor, so you need to break it up. You need to be able to get the water and the oxygen, everything into there, so that things can start to live. So once you've broken up your ground, then you can prepare it. And we have some examples here of different amendments that you can use on your ground, because you want to be adding some things for your plant to feed on. So the top left is actually kelp meal. You can get that at a feed store for cattle or horses. And we add that into the garden. It has many different nutrients. Then on the right we have alfalfa pellets. That's just ground up alfalfa plants. It adds nitrogen, which is in turn actually protein. That's what converts into protein in the plants.
Right.
We have some leaves, we have hay or straw or grass clippings or any of these things that can be added in to help the plants. So we're going to read one more quote here, and it says, "The seed placed in thoroughly prepared soil will produce its harvest." Now, maybe Timon, you can explain a little bit about organic matter and the importance.
Yes, so organic matter is basically, if you look it up online, it'll say it's anything that was once living. And here we're looking at different parts of plants that have now dried up or died. So we're looking at leaves, grass clippings can be very handy to add into the soil, sawdust, even weeds, when they're terminated, you can use them back into the soil and they will actually be feeding a lot of the life in the soil. You can use different manures from different animals, and with those you want to be careful because they can, when they're fresh, they can be pretty aggressive, and if they get added to plants that are growing there too close, it could burn the roots and it can have a bad effect on your plants. So you want manures to either be composted or put a little bit further away so they can slowly get worked into the soil. And also, you know, food scraps is also organic matter, so you can add those as well. All of those will feed the life in the soil that will actually make the nutrients available to the roots.
So that leads us into the macro and microorganisms that are actually in the soil. Now, we're not going to go into detail because it is very complex, but just a basic understanding I think is really helpful when we start looking at our own soil. If we understand the basic concepts, we don't need all the fine little detail to grow a nice plant.
Right.
So on the image here, we have our plants. Then underneath you see that organic matter, and that's any of the things that we just listed. Now, when we're talking about organisms in the soil, there's two main groups. I guess you could say three main groups, but the base level, the foundation of all life in the soil, is fungi and bacteria. Those two groups, bacteria and fungi, and those need to be in perfect balance. If you have one that's too high or another that's too high, then you're not going to be catering to the plants that are in your soil. Then the next layer of organisms are called, they're still under microorganisms, but they are single-cell organisms. So they can move around, they eat other things, and that is the protozoa, the nematodes, and the arthropods. Now, some arthropods are big, like spiders are under that category, or beetles, but some are microscopic. So when we look under the microscope, we see these nematodes. They look like little snakes, and they swim through the soil, and they will eat the fungi, and they will eat the bacteria. And this is actually a very important process. If you miss any of those little guys in your soil, then your nutrients will be stuck in your soil, and it won't get into your plants. So we're going to discuss a little bit how we can help each of these categories to grow. Now, this is just a very interesting fact. There are more living microorganisms in a tablespoon of healthy soil than there are people on the earth.
That's pretty awesome.
So there is a lot of life happening under the ground that we don't even see. And that is what actually gives the health to our plants.
Right. So there's two types of living mini creatures there in the soil, to say it simple, that really need to be there, but when you work your soil and you grow your garden, you want more of one of them. And so before I start explaining any more of this, I want to ask you guys a question. How long can you survive and be happy without breathing air? How long? I don't think we would go into anywhere past 3 minutes, right? So oxygen is very important for us to live and to operate and to exist. Now, in the soil, we have different layers, and as you go deeper, there is less and less oxygen available. And we have two types of bacteria here that are very different when it comes to their needs about oxygen. So the one is called the aerobes, and they include the word aero, which is helping us to know it's talking about oxygen. So those, they need oxygen to live and to work and to multiply. So aerobes are more in the top part of the soil because there's more oxygen available. And when the soil is well drained and when the soil is loose, then the air can go further down, and then these will have more space to live. And we know all, if there's more space to live, then there's probably going to be more work done and more multiplication happening. Then there's the anaerobes, and those are the guys that like it far down, deep down, where there's no air, not much light, cool, and they do their thing. Now, for our plants to grow, we want a decent bit of aerobe bacteria. And so if we work the soil and we allow air to get in there and we add organic matter that will feed them, then we're producing a very good environment for them to multiply and to work hard for us to feed our plants. So it's very important to keep that in mind. And it's pretty simple. I mean, you could study into it and there's lots to it, but that's kind of the basic of that. And if you have bacteria that are like anaerobes, those could be something like E. coli or others that can actually be dangerous for our plants or for us. So getting the oxygen in the soil is very crucial also to keep your plants healthy and then to keep the produce healthy that we eat. So I thought it would be kind of good to mention that.
We'll read a couple quotes from the University of Minnesota. Arthropods and earthworms consume soil, digest the bacteria, and excrete a clump of soil coated with secretion from the gut. This is getting more technical, but it's not too complicated. As beetles and earthworms chew and bury plant residue and burrow through the soil, they aerate the soil and create nutrient-lined channels for roots and water to move through. So when we have these little organisms, not the bacteria and the fungi, but the bigger ones that are moving a little bit of material, they're still microscopic. Some are bigger, like the earthworms or some beetles, but there's little guys too, and you need all of them. The earthworms are going to make these channels. Now the water and the air can get down deeper. Then you have the little guys like the nematodes, which are mini versions of earthworms, that make for the little root hairs to go through, and then the nutrients can travel nicely. And then when these bigger organisms eat the bacteria and eat the fungi, this is called chelation. Now it gets a little technical, but the bacteria and fungi are breaking down the rocks. And that is how you get the mineral to your plant. But if you don't have the big guys, it just stays in the bacteria and your plant never gets it. So you need the big guys to come and eat the little guys, and then the nutrients are chelated with the protein of that organism, and then it's bioavailable and given to the plants. So that's why you need all these guys living there. So the more organic matter we can give, the more oxygen we can give them, the right condition, the happier they are and the happier your plants will be. This is mycorrhizal fungi. They're friendly root invaders. So they actually go inside the root of your plant. The fungal hyphae extend from inside the root out into the soil and often greatly expand the plant's access to nutrients. So this is just explaining again that having the right balance of the bacteria and fungi is actually extremely beneficial. Now, this is a very interesting slide. In 1920, corn, this was commercially grown. This is not talking about your homegrown corn. This is commercial grown product, was 5% its weight in minerals. Now it is 0.5% its weight in minerals. Because of the abuse done to the soil, too many chemicals, killing all the microorganisms, all the things that are not good to sustaining a healthy plant. And then here's another slide to just emphasize this even stronger.
That is pretty epic, yeah.
So this is not talking about your garden that you're taking care of. This is the things that you're getting at your grocery store, but it's pretty scary. And sorry, the nutrient actually goes past into the beans there. But this is different plants, and iron in parts per million. So this was a study done every 20 years. So at the start, in 1943, tomatoes were actually the highest in iron, almost at 2,000 parts per million.
More than spinach.
More than spinach. And then in 1963, only 20 years later, after the industrialization of the food system happened, it dropped tomatoes all the way to 3. And spinach now became the highest relatively
23.
at 23. And this is when you have all the propaganda going about, oh, spinach is so high in iron and it makes you strong. We have Popeye cartoons and all these kind of things. But really, it was because there was such a crash. And they're trying to still make you think that, you know, the plants you're getting in the store, they look all nice and pretty, but really you're not getting anything. And in 1983, they wouldn't publish the results. So we only can imagine how poor it actually was.
Right. So this is not to be said that the food in the store has no nutrients in it, but you can see how different things impacted it in a way where it has a lot less of what we would expect. And so if we can grow food in our own garden, we can actually, with taking good care of it, we can actually bring our produce back to the levels we see there in 1943. And then our body will actually get what we need. Because if we eat produce that's very empty, if I can say it that way, then our body is going to be pretty hungry too, even though we ate all these healthy things. And so in order for us to be healthy and to get what we need to eat produce that's healthy and fresh and that has all the nutrients in it that our body needs. So that alone makes it worth it for me to try to grow as much as I can in my garden, because why would I not, right?
Yeah, and this is why we see people saying, oh, well, I know a lot of very sickly plant-based people. Well, that's because the food we're eating is poor. And people who eat meat, they're getting it secondhand, but the grass that the cows are getting is better than the food that we're eating from the store. So it's quite shocking, but when we grow our own food, then we can ensure that this is not the case.
Right.
And this leads into another topic called brix. B-R-I-X. This is a measurement of the fraction of sugar, and basically we use it to show the nutrient density in a food. Now, I'm going to grab something here.
Oh, yeah.
This is called a refractometer. And these used to be quite expensive. It's just a little tool. And you can use it to test any vegetable, any fruit, any of your foods, and see how much nutrients are in them. So before, when I was first getting these from after going through some of the nutrition schooling, they were around $200 for something like this, $300. But right now, we just ordered this one for $30 on Amazon. And it works just the same. There's no, it's going to read fine. So you can get one of these for as little as $25 to $35. And then you can see your own vegetables compared to the store. So all you do is you take some juice, you put a couple drops on the sight glass, and then you just close the lid and make sure that it's spread around the entire lens. And then when you look through it, unfortunately I can't show you what it looks like, but there's a gauge that goes from 0 to, depending on your refractometer, this one goes all the way up to 90. It goes quite high. Most are 0 to 32, which is plenty for any garden. If you're doing honey and things like that, then you need it to go up to at least 90 so that you can get the sugar content right. So you can test it with this, and then you have charts that you can look up what the density of the nutrients should be. So when we look at this chart here, you can look at something like apples. A poor apple would be 6 brix or under. The average is around 10. A good one would be 14, excellent 18. And there's a very interesting line on the end, which is disease-free. So when we're talking about brix, this is also the health of the plant itself. Just like us, the healthier we are, the more minerals and nutrients we have, the less we get sick. So the plants as well. Once they get a certain level, no bugs will harm them. Yes, deer will probably still eat your plants. They will love them at that point. But the little pest won't be bothering your plants. And they'll make you healthy as well. I have tested from the store peppers, tomatoes that were a 0 at the store. So they look nice and shiny and red, but they were just given the base thing just so to grow and look good on the shelf. and you got nothing from them. So if we look here, this is from highbrixgardens.com. This is a quote. Highbrix foods have greater carbohydrate levels. Carbohydrates are the fuel of the body and they're used for basic metabolic function. This has tremendous implication on digestion and human health. All disease is the result of a mineral deficiency. Highbrix plants are insect and disease resistant. Now take note to the last paragraph. Plants in poor health emit an electromagnetic frequency that insects tune into. This in effect calls them in for a feast. Plants in good health emit a different frequency that insects do not tune into. So when you have a sick plant, it actually says, come eat me. I need to be gotten rid of. I'm not good to anybody. So when you have a lot of insect pests, it's most likely you have a sick plant. That does not mean that when you plant your first year of garden, you have some cabbage moths on your cabbage to just, chop them up and throw them back in the ground. No, you can still eat those plants. They're much better from your store. But eventually, once you've put a lot of time and effort and diligence, you can get your plants to the point where they are virtually disease and insect free. I don't know if, Timon, you maybe talked about some of the sprays that we use here.
Yeah, we did.
They're fully organic. We don't use any chemicals. They're bacteria, and you can get it. It's called BTK, Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria in the soil, and you can mix it with water, spray it on the plants, and it'll affect only the pest insects. No bees, no dragonflies, frogs, all these things won't be hurt. Only the insects that are disturbing your plants will be affected.
So how come it doesn't impact those good animals?
Good question. So why does it do that? So in our digestive tract, talking about physiology now,
right,
we are all acid digestive system. So the first thing that happens is our stomach is acid. Now, all the beneficial creatures in the world, and this is how God made it, which is amazing, are all acid digestive system.
Right.
All the bad guys are alkaline digestive system. So the bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, gets eaten by these insects, and it only lives in an alkaline stomach. So anything that is a pest has an alkaline stomach, the bacteria grows, and then the insect will die. But anything that ingests the bacteria that has an acid stomach, it won't even be affected. The bacteria go in, they die in the stomach, and nothing happens. So you can go, I wouldn't necessarily do this, but you could spray the bacillus on your plant and then eat the plant and nothing would happen. Because it'll go into your stomach, it'll be die because it's in an acid digestive system. Dragonflies are acid, they're good, they eat your mosquitoes, everything. Mosquitoes are alkaline, which is why they use Bacillus thuringiensis, but they use I instead of BTK. So they add it to water, Israelius variety, and that goes into the mosquito and kills the mosquito. So it's the same thing, fully safe to use for anybody, but it's a really great way. You can apply it once every week, every 2 weeks, and the insects won't bother your plants.
Right.
So a little bit more on the brix. Poorly balanced soil will produce plants susceptible to disease. Properly balanced soil will produce plants resistant to disease. Insects and disease are the symptoms of a failing crop, not the cause of it. It's not the overwhelming invader we must fear, but the weakened condition of the victim. So this is just emphasizing again, the healthier we get our plants, the happier we're going to be. And also, I don't think this was in here, but the healthier your soil is, the less weeds you have.
That is true.
Because the balance of, remember I mentioned the bacteria versus fungi? That balance ratio for weeds needs to be high bacteria, no fungi. For your garden vegetables, they're balanced 50-50. So once you get that fungi and bacteria balance proper, the weeds actually are like, hey, I don't even have the right thing to grow, and they just don't grow. So the healthier we get all these things, all the pests start to become easier. Now you will get still some weeds, you're
Right.
still going to get things, but that's part of our work that we have to do on this world. Nothing's perfect.
Yeah.
But the better we get to God's plan,
Can definitely help.
definitely helps.
Okay, our next slide here talks about plant nutrition. All of us like to eat, and so do the plants. And here are just a couple natural amendments that you can get very easily from a feed store or a horticulture supplier. And those are all pretty safe to use. Obviously, you do want to, use them according to the recommendations on the packaging there, and make sure you don't use too much. Or sometimes if you use too little, you might not see an effect right away. But overall, it's always better to start a bit easier and then add a little bit more later if necessary. Here we have, for example, alfalfa pellets. They can be very helpful to bring nitrogen into the soil. There's limestone. It's basically ground up limestone, very fine powder form that can be added in.
And that's for calcium.
Right, that will bring calcium in. Then kelp, soft rock, phosphate, which is similar to the limestone, I guess. Then also compost and borax, which has the boron in it, and that just a tiny bit will last for quite a while. So those are things you can add in. One thing that is important to remember is that none of these things work overnight. So it's a good practice to apply those amendments either early in the spring, potentially late in the fall, even a little bit, and give them some time to come available, because if your plants are turning yellow and weak, and then you dump a bunch of this by the plant there, it's not going to help overnight. It might take a few weeks even before it makes any effect.
These aren't instant chemical band-aids.
Right.
These are things that take process of the organisms working them to your plants.
Right.
So it might take maybe 2 weeks or something for it to become available.
That's true, yeah.
And I'd like to just mention a little bit on the borax. Why did we include that there?
Yes.
Places like New Zealand, some other places don't have boron in the ground naturally. So just because of the landscape, there's no boron, and borax is almost entirely boron. So borax, that's just the laundry detergent you can get at any store. It's a box, and all you need is a teaspoon to a tablespoon for 100 square foot bed of garden. So you need very little, and that gives plenty of boron, and boron helps with the immune system of your plant to create it to be healthy.
All right. Something else that's talked about quite often when it comes to gardening and growing your own food is something called crop rotation. And I believe it's something that's very important, and yet sometimes it can be maybe a little bit overrated. So what crop rotation means is basically that you will put different types of plants in different locations in your garden, and you rotate them so that they all get a new fresh spot every year. And there's plants that are really hungry. They're hardworking plants, and they're hungry, and they feed heavy. And if you put them in the same spot every year, they will get weaker and they won't get as much as they want anymore, and then your crop won't turn out as good. So if you rotate them around, they'll have lots to eat every time they come into a new location. And then there's other plants that don't need as much, so they could come sometime in between. And then there's plants that are actually the opposite. They are very giving. They take stuff from the air, and this could be a long seminar here, but basically I'm just going to make it simple. Those actually absorb good things, and they put it into the ground, and they actually fill up the ground. For example, beans or different types of legumes, they'll actually help build up your soil. They'll put nitrogen back into the soil. So if you rotate your crops, you can actually benefit all your plants by taking out and putting back in and kind of going around like that. Now, if you have a small garden and you plant your crops very closely mixed together, and you kind of have a little bit of everything everywhere, then it's not as crucial to make sure each plant gets that other inch next year. But if you do like beds full of different crops, then it's a very good practice to have different crops there every year. And sometimes, if you have lots of land, it's okay to also let it rest some time and then go back to it next year and it'll be full of strength again. I don't know if there's anything else.
Yeah, and just, I guess as a rule of thumb, what I would say, like some of the heavy feeders like corn, there's others that are very heavy, but
Squash
after
is
you,
pretty heavy feeder
squashes or pumpkins, something
Right.
like that, after those things have been planted there, you could plant a bean of some kind or a legume or a pea, any of those in that family, string beans, all of them work the same. They help to regenerate that soil. So
Right.
as a general rule of thumb, if you plant something next year, throw your beans there. And then it'll just help that process a little bit more.
That's right.
And then we're going to talk about composting. Now this is something that both me and Timon are really excited about and really excited about doing here at AD. You've seen the picture of our compost turner there. Unfortunately, I haven't had quite as much practical experience as Timon has, so he's going to explain a little bit about the composting.
Yeah. So when we talk about composting here, we refer to thermal composting, which
This isn't rotted food, okay? There's a huge difference between taking your food, throwing it in a pile, and it getting stinky and smelly, and the compost that we're talking about.
right. So in this process of composting with temperature, you're basically getting the soil through a process where it gets completely, everything breaks down and then it builds it back up. Here we use different ingredients. We use different manures from different animals. We use hay, we use straw, you can add wood chips, leaves. We add all the weeds from our fields that we pick, go all in there. We do use food scraps from the kitchen as well. Then you want to add some clay or some soil that's got no rocks in it to just help build that up a little bit better too. And then there's different microorganisms that you can add in form of like a water spray that you can add in as well to help get the process started good. And just like we talked about earlier about the different type of bacteria that's out there, we need to be very careful how we make the compost. So there's one thing, also when you add lots of grass clippings and green stuff, the compost will heat up. It will get hot. Like if you stick your hand in there, it'll just about burn your fingers. So with that process, it's very important that you bring fresh air in that pile, especially at the beginning, the first week or two. You want to aerate that thing every day. Get it turned over so that the air can get in there and all the bad gases that start creating at the beginning can get out. And that will support the growth of the aerobe bacteria that we need to work in there. And basically what happens in the thermal compost, these bacteria and the heat together break down everything. So you can throw weeds in there that have seeds. If the compost is done right and you turn it so that the inside comes to the outside and the outside parts come in so that every part of the pile has been in the inside being cooked for at least 24 hours, then there is no weed seeds that will germinate after this process. Even sickness and disease will be eliminated. And by, let's say, depending on your conditions and what you add in, between 8 to 10 weeks, you'll have really good soil that has very good nutrients and minerals in it, and that will be healthy. And one thing that really helps you to know that is when the compost is cooled down. If there's no more heat created in that pile, then you know it's toward the end of this process. Another thing is if it smells bad, then there's a high chance that you didn't get enough oxygen in there. And sometimes that happens if you get a lot of wet materials and old materials that have been laying somewhere for a while. Then your pile could stop working, it could kind of collapse and go into an anaerobe process that really smells bad. So what's important is when you use compost, you need good compost. If you put compost in your garden that has still lots of heat in it, that's warm, compost that smells bad, compost that hasn't finished its process, then it will actually harm your plants. And I've seen different times where bad compost was used on crops, And one time there was actually a crop that has been completely eliminated, like the crop got killed by adding hot compost on it. So it's very important that the composting is done right, and I don't think that just what we're saying here right now will be enough for you to just go ahead and make one. There's lots of different information online that you can find about thermal composting, and you want to kind of study into that a bit to understand the concept of it. You want to check the temperature, you want to check the moisture, you want to check the CO2 levels. Now, when my family and we started doing composting at home like that, we actually started with a small pile. It was maybe like 2.5, 3 meters long, 2 meters wide, and about 1.5 meters tall. And we added all the ingredients from the farm we had in different layers. We watered a bit, put our microorganisms in, and then we had 2 pitchforks. And I'm the oldest of 4 boys, so our whole family added up to 6 people, and we were 2 and 2 at a time, would go with 2 pitchforks, 1 on each side, and we would turn that whole pile over. And when we got tired, the next 2 people jump in, and so we would go through the whole thing by hand, and after a couple weeks, we had compost that had cooled down, that smelled good, that was ready to use. And so we had used it for many, many years, and then we were looking at getting a compost turner, and the new one is pretty expensive. If you just have a small garden, it's probably not worth it for you to get one. So we prayed, and I looked with my dad quite a bit, and then we found this compost turner, which is actually on our farm here in this picture there. This one is an older one, but it works well, and we got it for probably, I don't know, 5% of the cost of a new one. It's very, very cheap, but still very good. And so once we got that, then we hooked that up to a tractor, and we were able to make a lot more compost. And we've had people over the years that would come and they would say, "Can I please have some of your compost?" They would say, "I shovel it off your farm there. I'll shovel it onto my trailer by hand. It's so good, my plants grow so well." So we use it a lot in our fields at home, and the soil has gotten a lot better, and our crops are doing really well. And right now my parents going through a drought where there's not much rain for weeks and months already. And they haven't had much water to even water the garden, but their crops are still growing because the soil has been well built up and it holds the water, and the plants are actually doing pretty good still. So again, just a disclaimer there, it needs to be good compost. The process needs to be finished before you apply it to your plants, and there's a little bit more study that goes into it before I would suggest that you do it, so this is not quite enough. Here's just a short clip where you can see in a slow motion video how the compost turner picks up the materials. This is probably 1.5 weeks, 2 weeks into the process, and it picks it up and it throws it back behind itself and builds up a new windrow. And the way how the knives are set up is so that they take the outside and throw it in the center on the back, so that everything gets into that core of that windrow once through that process to get sanitized and cleaned and heated up.
Yeah, and on the compost again, this is how, or the main way, we get a huge influx of that good bacteria and microorganisms in our ground.
Right.
By producing this compost. Now, when I was doing here, we have a microscope that we can look at the soil and see every little bacteria, every little organism. And that's part of one of the schooling that I went to, is identifying some of these things. And it's very fascinating. Because in the area here, I took samples of the soil and it was virtually dead. Even bacteria were having struggle. So then we started making some compost piles, just small ones, because we didn't have the big turner, we didn't have Timon at the time. And but you would see organisms showing up that were never in the area before, just because there might be eggs dormant, asleep there for decades. In the material, they will show up in the air, they will come on animals, they will find a way. Wherever you make a good environment for these to thrive, they will show up. And you could take a soil sample. The first time you take a sample of the compost, there's almost nothing there,
right,
because it's virtually dead. In a couple days, only days, you have, when you're looking on the slide of the microscope, you can't follow everything. It's just moving so fast. There's so many organisms just moving around, doing their thing. And it's quite an amazing process. Now, not everybody has a microscope and see that, but one of the ways that Timon mentioned that we test that is with a thermometer.
Right.
So you check the temperature, and that's how you know your compost is good.
Right.
Now, the ones that we're using are 4 feet long thermometers. They're not short ones.
Yeah, you stick them right into
Stick
the
it right
pile,
in
and
the
then
pile.
you can see the temperature. And it's important that you kind of control that environment. If it gets too hot, your pile can get close to starting to burn almost. So you have to turn it to get it to cool down, get the fresh air in there again, and get all the CO2 out so that it keeps operating properly.
A good compost pile temperature is anywhere from 135 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. That's Fahrenheit.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's how I'm thinking because
Right.
that's the course I was taking
Yeah.
from the States.
In Celsius, you want to try around 70 to 80 degrees. You don't want to get any higher than that.
And you can
then,
realize how hot that is
that can
actually.
definitely burn your fingers. So you need a certain heat, but if you're somewhere in that range, you're probably pretty good. It also depends on the time of the year when you do it. In the spring, it's going to be harder to heat it up because you don't have so much fresh material. Once you get into the summer and fall and you have lots of green grass, lots of weeds, lots of other scraps from the field from harvest and kitchen scraps, and you add all these fresh things in, I mean, some of you might notice when you cut grass with your lawnmower and you pile up all the grass clippings on the pile, I mean, within 6 or 7 hours, if that grass has any moisture in it, it will start heating up in that pile. And after a day or two, if you open it up, you will see it's already white in there, it's hot and it's steaming. And that's a very similar process to what the composting that we're doing here does. So you want to make sure you get that air in there and you get it to get fresh air and make sure you get that CO2 out and also not get it too hot. Because that grass pile, it could even potentially start burning if it's big enough, right? So, yeah.
And the reason that it's heating up is the organisms are multiplying. That's what's actually creating the heat. So there you know that you have the right ingredients because your heat is building. So that can happen within 24 hours. You go from cold pile all the way to
hot,
80 degrees.
Yeah.
And it happens very quickly. Bacteria are very small, and they don't take very long to reproduce. 15 minutes, some of these are every 15 minutes doubling every 15 minutes. Some are even faster, some are a little longer. Some of your big guys, the arthropods that are really necessary, they can take half an hour up to an hour. But they're very important. Maybe you could read this?
Sure. So here's another quote from the Bible. And I think we all remember how Adam was out there in the field and God was talking to him, and he basically said that the ground was cursed for our sake. And I'll just read here the highlighted parts. It says, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. And then therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken." So one thing that is important to understand is here that gardening is not going to be easy because the ground was cursed for a reason, and that's going to stay until things are over in this world. So it will be hard work, we will be sweating, and we will be dealing with things that are not nice in the garden, okay? However, it also says that we need to till the ground and do our part to keep it clean and to do our part to grow the things that God wants us to be able to harvest there. We have another one here that talks about there's a time for everything, right? And it's very important to know what times we have to do what in the garden, right? There's a time to plant the seeds, and that time is probably not in the fall, 2 weeks before the first frost. And then there's a time for us to weed and to take care of the plants, and then there's times where we need to be harvesting and get that stuff out of the ground. So that's a very nice verse that plays into that, and it helps us to understand that we're not making the timing in the garden. The garden is made by God for us, and we have to study it and figure out and learn what time is there for what process, right?
And then we come to time to seed.
Right.
So you've worked your ground, you've prepared it. Now, this all doesn't happen the first time. So don't be discouraged if you don't have time to do all the compost, do all the everything. Still, just start. Start small, do something. It's not going to be perfect. Your plants might not be fully huge and beautiful and as healthy as you want them, but you'll have something, and you'll start the process.
Right.
So now we're at time to seed. So if we look at different seed types, there's three main categories. We have hybrids, and these are seeds that do not produce true. Now maybe Timon can explain a little bit some of the differences here.
Yeah, so basically hybrid seed it's a seed that is in its first generation where it's been cross-pollinated, and you use very controlled environments to only bring the pollen in of the plant that you want to cross it with. And so it's very, very controlled environment. And then by combining either two or more lines of two different plants that you want to really get in there with the characteristics that you want, the color, the taste, the size, whatever the fruit should be, you can get very good crops out of that, and they'll be very even in the production, in the growth, in the color, and the taste, and everything. So hybrids overall are kind of a human-developed step up from what naturally happens out there. And they're not necessarily bad, but if you want to save your own seed, it's pretty hard because, let's say you take a carrot, for example. So you grow it this year with hybrid seed. In the fall, you harvest the carrot. You store it all winter. Next year, you go ahead and you plant it back into the soil, and the carrot grows a new plant and makes big flowers. And those flowers now will eventually produce seed. And when that goes to seed, that seed has information that's unthinkable of. I've tried it myself, and then you plant the seed the year after. I had white carrots, I had yellow carrots, I had some purple ones, red ones, some orange ones. Some tasted so bad that I didn't want to continue eating them. Some were big, some were small. It was crazy. But if you have the hybrid seed in the first generation, all of them are orange, all of them are straight, all of them are sweet. So from that perspective, the hybrid itself is not bad, but if you want to save your seed, it's going to be very unhelpful for you to get anything that's a good variety that you can continue on with.
And they're not the same as GMO.
Right.
There's a big difference between hybrid and GMO.
Maybe you want to explain the GMO for us.
Yeah. No, hybrids are not dangerous to eat. So that's not the concern with the hybrids. It's only if we can't buy seed anymore, or if you want to be having varieties that are getting used to your area, then they're not the best option, but they're very consistent. They're typically, especially in corn, there's not a lot of what I would say really great super sweet corn that's open pollinated or heirloom.
Yeah.
So hybrids are nice for that. They taste better, which doesn't mean that they're bad. But they're not GMO. GMO is a totally another thing. Hybrids can happen naturally in nature, but the ones you buy are just done more controlled. It's not something that's over-forced. Like genetically modified, they take the genes and they actually splice them apart and enter new information there, and it changes the entire plant, and there can be a lot of side effects from eating GMO foods. Hybrids, you can buy the seed at a grocery store, at a garden store, and plant them. You actually can't do that with GMOs. If you go and you pick a seed packet that's for your garden, none of them are going to be genetically modified. So you have no worries that if you pick a random seed packet off the shelf, it's going to be GMO.
Right.
But if you take the food that's in the grocery store, that can be GMO. Because they don't allow anyone that is not a commercial contract grower to grow GMO seeds because it's so controlled. And if you I used to live in Saskatchewan, they have big farms. We're talking like 20,000 acres, 50,000 acres, some of the farmers I knew there. And one of the farmers, he had a lot of land and he was doing canola. And canola is all GMO. And he had a volunteer crop, so that means that some of the seeds went on the ground and they started to grow. Since he didn't pay for those seeds, they came and made him terminate the entire crop because he didn't pay for that. So he had to till everything under, and he got no crop that year because he didn't seed it and he didn't buy it from them, contract. So you don't have to worry, you're not buying any GMO seeds. And then the next group we have is open pollinated / heirloom, because they're actually the same thing.
Right.
The only difference is the fancy word heirloom means that it's very old. Open pollinated
Could be a new variety.
can be a new variety, but it is still the same characteristics, which means that you can keep the seed and it's going to be the same plant year after year. So you plant, like Timon was saying, a carrot or some beans or whatever it may be, save the seed, plant it again, you're going to get the same variety.
Right.
The only difference is the hybrids are going to act very similar every single year because it's that same strain. An open pollinated, now this is a good thing and a bad thing,
Right.
they actually adapt to the climate they're grown in. So they're the same variety, but they actually start changing. So if the season's different, the soil's a little different, the rain is a little bit different, moisture, they'll actually start changing. So one nice thing is if you start your garden, every year you keep your seed, it's going to get better because the plant's more adapted to your area. And those seeds, maybe when you bought them, maybe they were grown in India, maybe they were grown in Mexico, maybe they were grown in some place like this, but then you're living in Canada and the weather's different, but you can get that plant to change over time. And that's how a lot of the open varieties come about, is they have one, and they just pick the seeds of the plants that they like the best, that grew the best, save them, do it again the next year, and you can do that yourself.
Right.
So I threw this in here. It's a very funny one, but it's something that's very easy and that can actually really help your plants, especially when maybe you don't have time to do all the amendments that we talked about. So this is a foliar spray, which means you spray it on the plant. It can be with just a squeeze hand sprayer or a pump sprayer, anything like that. And you take a liter of Coca-Cola, you take some hydrogen peroxide, some kelp, molasses, and Tums. Now, what is the point of all this? The Coca-Cola adds phosphorus, so that helps with the fruiting of your plant. So things like tomatoes love this. The hydrogen peroxide helps get oxygen into the plant. And then the kelp adds all the different micronutrients from the sea, because all the minerals from all the rivers go into the ocean, and then the kelp absorbs all that, so you have up to 90 minerals in kelp. And then you have, this is actually feed molasses, I want to clarify that, not blackstrap from the store, the expensive stuff. You get it in a big 50-pound bag, they use it for horses, and this is dry, it's a powder. You add that in, and then Tums doesn't have to be name brand, and the Coca-Cola neither. It can be any brand, the cheapest one you can find. The Tums, just calcium tablets, 1,000 milligram calcium tablets. You throw that in there, shake it up, let it sit and dissolve, and then you spray that on your plant. And you will see them grow like crazy.
Yeah.
And if you actually test them with the refractometer, it's not just an outward effect. Because we gave a lot more than what the chemical companies are doing. They're only giving 3, and they're only the visual ones. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
That's right.
And that just makes a big plant nice looking, but it doesn't actually give the nutrients. But we added kelp, we added molasses, which has tons of minerals in it. We added phosphorus, all these nice things that is actually helping your plant, and you can actually test the difference. I grew a set of tomatoes that didn't have any of this, and then I used this, and I test the difference, and there was almost a double brix level in the ones that had this.
Wow.
Now, maybe you can read the next few slides.
Yes. So this is slicing another chapter here. So we're talking about a quote from Selected Messages, Volume 3, page 328. And here it talks about Ellen White, where she was in Australia, and she says, "While we were in Australia, we adopted the plan of digging deep trenches and filling them in with dressing that would create good soil. this we did in the cultivation of tomatoes, oranges, lemons, peaches, and grapes. The man of whom we purchased our peach trees told me that he would be pleased to have me observe the way they were planted. I then asked him to let me show him how it had been represented in the night season that they should be planted. I ordered my hired man to dig a deep cavity in the ground, then put in rich dirt, then stones, then rich dirt. After this, he put in layers of earth and dressing until the hole was filled. I told the nurseryman that I had planted in this way in the rocky soil in America. I invited him to visit me when these fruits should be ripe. He said to me, "You need no lesson from me to teach you how to plant the trees." Our crops were very successful. The peaches were the most beautiful in coloring and the most delicious in flavor of any that I had tasted. We grew the large yellow Crawford and other varieties, grapes, apricots, nectarines, and plums. So here's a little drawing to just show a little bit what this is talking about. We have some different layers here. You can see if we go down from the top, we have grass clippings, or you can use leaves or other mulching material. Then we have some rocks, and they are around the tree, kind of under the roots. Then we have different decomposed leaf mold, vegetable compost, grass compost. We can add manure in. And then if the soil has no rocks in it, you can also add rocks in it to help make more minerals available over time. Also, there's a couple other things added up here, like you can mix the dirt with some kelp and some rock phosphate and some calcium lime, and then they also added in ocean water, which brings a lot of salt and other minerals in. And then they did actually put some pipes in there to help with some air. And then you can add worms if you can find them somewhere. So this is basically the description of the planting method that Ellen White described, and it's basically up to the standard that anyone would plant a good fruit tree today, like in nursery or agriculture. Those are really good practices, and those will really help your trees to grow well. And the different layers there are just to help the tree have different things available, and also the rocks are there, like we said, the bacteria will break down the minerals and make it available for the tree as well. So all these things are very good things to do. I don't know if there's anything else we want to mention on this.
Like the stone for the foundation under there, if your plant doesn't have a strong taproot.
Right.
But none of these things are salvational.
Right.
We want to clarify that.
Yes.
And none of the things we showed before are salvational either. These aren't things that we should be judging others upon, or, oh, did you do your compost right, or did you do this, or add that?
Well, you better put 3 rocks there, not just 2,
yes.
right?
No, these are really good principles. They fall in line with everything from all the schooling that Timon's had, from I've had. They match perfectly with science. If you don't have something, don't worry about it. Your tree is not going to be unusable or uneatable.
Right.
You should still go and plant your tree. And if you don't have some things, you can always add some things later.
That's right.
It will take a little bit of time to work its way down the soil, but if later you get some kelp, sprinkle it on top around the tree.
Right. And something that can help when you add in different amendments later, for example, for orchard trees and stuff, it can be helpful if you leave a small area around the tree bare soil, and then you can put those things in there and work them into the soil so they actually stay moist and they break down faster. And then if you water it sometimes, that'll help to bring it down too. But for trees, it could take a few years actually before everything is available for the plant. So it might not be like in 2 weeks. So if you add things every year, that will help, and then over time it will make it there. But yeah, that can really help trees to have good fruit as well.
Now, after this time, beyond what the time that we're preparing for, there's another time. And it says, then will be the time for us to trust wholly in God. And that's what we're working towards. That's the whole process that we're doing here.
Right.
Starting in the city, You're going to the country, using more faith, to the point where you're going to have to trust wholly in God because His angels are going to be leading us and we're going to be fleeing into the wilderness.
Right.
I saw that our bread and water will be sure at that time, and that we shall not lack or suffer hunger. For God is able to spread a table for us in the wilderness. If necessary, He would send ravens to feed us as He did feed Elijah, or rain manna from heaven as He did for the Israelites.
That's
so
right.
This is the promise that we are working towards, is total and utter reliance on God.
Right. And so growing your own garden doesn't mean that you're now independent from everybody and everything. Growing your garden will teach you a lot of things and then help you, just like Mackenzie said, to make that step further. And then there will be a time where we won't be able to grow a garden, where we have to flee into the mountains. We won't have tools there. We won't have a tractor there. We won't have seeds, nothing. We'll just be there. And we know that the Bible says this time will be shortened, but still that time will come. And that's the time when we really can trust God and where He will take care of us, because there will be no other way. So we want to point out that gardening for yourself is not something where you can now keep yourself safe and you don't need nobody else and you don't need God. We need God in every step of this journey, and we need Him to help us learn to grow food. And when we are at that point and that time comes where we get to the next step, then He'll help us to be ready for that. And then we won't have to worry about weeding the garden anymore. So I'm looking forward to that.
And having our gardens and things is not a selfish thing.
Right.
We're preparing for ourselves, yes, but we're also preparing for anybody else that may need help as well. We should not now say, oh, I have my garden, but I only did enough for myself. It said in the quote, God will bless 20 acres as much as 100. So we need to claim that, and we need to know that God, like He did the feeding of the 5,000, He only had a few things, and He multiplied it to feed everybody. When we're talking about the preparation we're needed, Noah built his ark. We're trying to build an ark. But if God wasn't holding that ship, the amount of destruction that the world was in would have tore that ship in pieces.
Oh, yeah.
It is only because they still had faith. He followed everything God said, but still God had to be holding that ship. And He had to still be holding the food that was in there and the water that would be enough for everybody inside.
Right.
God will bless when we go in faith and we do the things that He asks us.
Even if that makes us sweat sometime.
So a few questions that came in online. The Tums that you mentioned, does it matter if they're coated or not?
Good question. Yes, it matters. It does matter. Uncoated. It's fine if they're peppermint flavored. The uncoated ones are peppermint flavored. That's no problem. But yes, if they're coated, they're not going to break down.
Okay.
So that's going to inhibit the absorption for sure.
Yeah, good point.
And then at what point do you move your plants around? What point should you do crop rotation and that kind of thing?
That's a good question. I'm not 100% sure how
I think I know what they're asking.
how it applies to what point, but yeah.
So what we're meaning by that is not that you're taking the plant that you planted and moving it.
Oh,
It's
sure.
Once you're done with that plant for that year. So let's say you plant carrots in this spot right here. You have carrots here, you have corn, then you have beans.
Right.
So after you pulled all your carrots out of the ground, you pulled all your corn, you pulled all your beans, now the next year when you seed, don't put corn in the same spot.
Right.
That's what we're meaning. We're not
Yes.
saying pull out your carrots,
that's
move
good.
them to where the beans were in the same season.
So
It's
yes,
from-
to clarify, you do not need to rotate your crops as they're growing and maturing. So if they take a full season, plant them there, let them grow there, harvest them from there, let the snow fall, and let the winter come. And next year when you plant your new garden, put that type of plants or crops into a different location so that the ground here can rest and be built up with other plants, for example, like we said, beans.
And I know for crop rotation, certain plants need to move a little bit faster than others. I know garlic is one. Can you tell us a little bit about garlic?
So with garlic, it's a very specialized plant. It's a heavy feeder like corn, but it's also, it puts a lot of acid into the soil, so it actually breaks down the friendly organisms there very quickly. So if you plant garlic in the same spot, it can become anaerobic and unhealthy extremely quickly. So that's one of the plants that's actually, you have to be careful that you don't put in the same area. That's a good point.
How often would you rotate garlic?
Just each season. And then the general rule of thumb is don't put it back in that spot till 3 years later.
Yeah.
Now that can be alleviated a little bit by adding a lot of compost and all this kind of stuff. But for garlic, since it is very acidic to the soil, 3-year rotation. So you're going to move it from there.
And if you have enough space in your garden and you can rotate around without making it too much hassle for yourself, it's okay if you rotate it and you only come back every 6 or 7 years. There's not a specific number, but the more years you give it, the more likely it will be that you get really good results in that spot again. So if you can, the more time you give, the better, but give it at least a handful of years. That will really up your results.
And next question I have here is, what do you recommend for those who aren't as young anymore to do for gardening? Are there any things that can help people who are not as easy with bending or whatever it may be?
I think I have some ideas there.
Okay.
So one thing that can really help, and we did this back at home for different elderly people, and even for my grandma, she really loved it. We built raised beds that were quite high. So they can be like 4 or 5 feet high, depending on the person's wishes and however it's most comfortable for them. You can build raised beds even 4 or 5 feet high, and you can fill them with different materials. That can be on the bottom from branches, different grass clippings, hay, straw, all your weeds, everything can go in there, and then you give it a good layer of good compost and soil on the top. A raised bed will actually create some extra heat in itself, and it will be a bit of a better climate, and it's going to be easy to get there to weed, it's going to be easy to harvest, and you can even cover it easily if there's still a cold night coming on in the end of spring. So raised beds can definitely be an option. There's probably a lot of other options. Something that can also help is if you have hand tools that have a long enough handle, and if you add some sand to your soil, add some other like peat moss or stuff so the soil gets a bit softer, it can help you to work it better too. I don't know if you have any other ideas.
Yeah, and the other benefit of the raised bed is that it's not on the ground, and actually the cold air likes to sit there. So it can help a little bit with the frost too.
Yeah.
Like you said, the longer tools, like we showed there, some of those, just the push tillers that you can just push through the garden, and they're not a lot of effort.
They self-drive, I think, too, right? Self-propelled?
You can get the ones that go themselves.
Yes.
That helps a lot.
And then also, I would suggest, I mean, there's always young people around somewhere. It's okay to get them involved. That's what my great-grandma did. She was 88 years old. She had 2 new knees and a new hip, and she was walking with a crutch, but she still worked the garden that was almost half an acre big. And she put me and my brothers to work, and she said, you guys help me here and do this. And so I think it's okay to involve the youth and get them helping too, because they need to learn that at some point they will need that too, right? So if you can, if it's your own grandchildren, that's great. If it's the neighbor's grandchildren and they want to learn something, you don't have to put them to work like slaves, but you can have them give you a hand and do certain things that you can't do anymore with your back. And so working together, you might still be able to grow a really nice garden.
And actually another thing that I've seen work really nicely, especially for older people who, like, with the weeding is one of the most labor-intensive parts, is mulching.
Yes.
So that's something we didn't actually mention here. When you plant your garden, then you can take straw. I wouldn't recommend hay, because hay has a lot of seeds and it can start to grow, but straw, or if you have goats, I have goats as a pet. They're our manure machine. and we give the hay to the goats, and they eat all the weed seeds and they leave the straw behind. So that has no weed seeds. So then I take the straw and put it around the plants that are around the rows, thick
Right.
enough that the weeds don't come through.
Yeah.
And then that also adds good organic matter. The microbes start breaking that down from the soil,
And it
and
keeps
that can
moisture
help
in,
a
yeah.
lot. Helps with the moisture, so you don't have to water as much. Also, this year we did some wood chips on some of the places as well. Didn't have to weed it once.
Right.
But the wood chips adds good organic matter, keeps the moisture in there, and that can help a lot.
Yeah. Grass clippings can
Grass
help
clippings,
too. You just
yep.
want to make sure that you either let them dry really well before you apply them, or you just apply them in thin layers, because if grass clippings start rotting there, they will actually make your plants smell bad too, and you can bring in disease and sickness that you wouldn't want to bring in there. So you make sure it's really dry before you apply it, or you apply it really thin and
Yeah.
every week, so then it builds up a dry layer as well.
So someone just asked if, when you do the mulching, do you leave it there? Do you till it in? Well, that's kind of, it's up to you. It depends on the system that you're growing in. Depends if you have beds, depends if you're doing rows, if you're doing a field, if you're
Right.
what kind of crop you're doing. There's no right or wrong answer. It's organic matter. It's on the ground. You can till it in if you have to. If you want to, you can leave it there and try plant, but most likely over the winter, that's going to be so broken down that it's not helping you next year for any of the weeds, so you'll have to add more anyways. So I would till it in, then it opens the soil up a little bit again, gets that organic matter deeper, so those good bacteria start growing. The farther down you get them, the healthier your soil.
Right.
So the more organic matter deeper, the more air deeper, the better it is. And then just reapply. You can use leaves as too. If you rake up some leaves, you can use that. That's good.
Can you expand a little bit on the difference between raised beds and field planting? What would you recommend? Is there a better? Is there a worse? I know you talked about elderly people might want the raised beds,
Right.
but for somebody who doesn't, it doesn't matter. What would you recommend?
Generally speaking, if your soil is really bad and you don't have much space, raised beds can be a really good option because you don't have to pick rocks. You just have to fill it up and then you can grow already. To build raised beds is a little bit of work, and if you use good materials, it can involve some cost. Raised beds will not last forever, so you have to plan that depending on what wood and what material you use, it will be needing replacement after a few years. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, depending on your climate and the material. So raised beds can be a really good start. You can get really good results in a small space. But if you want to grow enough for your whole family for a whole year, it's going to be pretty hard to do that all in raised beds because you'll need a lot of them. And that'll cost you a lot of money to build them and to fill them and to rebuild them after a couple of years. So if you do want to do bigger scale, I would do it straight in the field. If you want to start small and you don't have much space and your soil is really terrible, a raised bed can be a really good kickstart for your gardening experience and help you to get some good produce out there quickly.
Another thing with the raised beds for the field, that's not necessarily, it's kind of an open-ended question because you can have the field style where you're doing single rows,
Right.
or you can have the field style where you're doing a plot,
Yeah.
or you're doing a slightly, it's called a raised bed, but a
Right.
hilled bed. It's
Yeah.
not raised with wood or anything like that, but it's hilled up. So you have a slightly raised surface. And some of the beds that we have here in the garden are hilled. So you'll see a walking path and then a little bit raised up. And there's a couple of benefits there. One, it drains better
Right.
and doesn't wash away your crop because if you get a heavy rain, it'll run down the walking path. If you do that, you can do a raised bed in the field
Right.
where you pile up some material, maybe 6 to 8 inches.
Yeah.
And then you're not building a 4-foot raised bed or even a 12-inch raised bed, but you're still not trying to go down into that hard soil right away.
That's right.
Eventually, you probably want to start working that and picking the rocks or finding some way to fix that. But you can pile material on there like like some straw, some wood chips, some things like that, and some compost, and then that'll pick it off the ground a little bit.
Right. So it always depends a bit on what you understand by saying raised bed. It could be a bed that's like a big wooden box that's 5 feet tall. It could be a short one. It could be just hilling the soil to make raised beds that are this high, and that'll just give you a little bit extra good soil and make walkways that are just a bit lower. So it depends a little bit on what you understand by that. But overall, it can be really helpful, yeah.
And maybe I'll say as well that when you're planting on a field style, the single rows have some benefits, but the beds have other benefits. So there's sometimes a give and a take there. Things like squash, you can't plant 6 squash plants right beside each other in a little bed and expect them to do good. They spread out, they get very big. That's why in a raised bed, like a 5-foot bed, you might only want your squash plants right on the outside, and then they can overflow and get out of the way instead of taking a whole 20-foot raised bed just because you have 2 squash plants.
Right.
So some things actually like to be grown in rows tight together. If you notice, Timon planted the carrots, they're in rows, which helps the weeds stay down because the soil likes to be covered. It doesn't like to be naked. It's just like people. Yeah. We don't like to be naked, or we shouldn't like to be naked. And it wants to be covered. So whether it's going to cover it with weeds because you didn't cover it, it's going to find a way. Right. So if you plant your crops in a way that's not so tight that they're choking each other, but that covers the weeds when they start growing, or if you put the mulch, that also makes the soil happy. It's like, okay, we don't need to put any weeds here. We have some covering. So that's a big topic, though.
Yeah, it is.
Awesome. Well, thank you for touching it. The last question here I have is, where can we learn more from these gentlemen?
On ADTV.
That's what I thought.
That's
and
right.
Of course, we have the How to Country series. So anybody who is wanting to have more of this type of information, we have started an entire series called How to Country. And there is already some posted videos on YouTube. There's one specifically breaking down the different types of seeds. We have some with Timon going through. We also have a bee keeping one that we started, just the preliminaries on bees. And we are going to expand that much more in the future. So if you are looking for more courses or more information, follow the How to Country at Amazing Discoveries. And also join the Telegram, because there is a lot of information on Telegram that has to do with grounds and gardening as well.
Yeah. And gives little updates just through, as we're working, we post stuff there for people that isn't a nice enough video for YouTube, but just a clip of what we're doing.
I just wanted to say something about the Ellen G. White method for planting the trees. You mentioned about that, and I think you're right, it's 100% not salvational. If you have components that are missing, plant your tree. But if you follow that method, it will produce a stronger tree faster.
That's right.
Is that correct?
You will have very good results, and none of this is bad. All of this is very good and should be done as close as you can. But we just wanted to point out that shouldn't, if one of them rocks missing, doesn't mean that you shouldn't plant your tree now. Your tree will still grow, but go and do as much as you can of that method in your garden when you plant trees, and you'll have really good results.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. And again, if you have more gardening questions, do you have a question that you want to shout out? How tall should the tree be before you plant it?
That's a good question. It'll depend a little bit on what type of tree you're planting. Generally speaking, you want the tree big enough that if the grass were to grow up around it, it kind of gets above that already. The smaller the trees, the more you have to protect it from the deer and other wild animals.
Even mice.
Even mice can get in there. So you want to make sure that your tree has a decent size. But I wouldn't say that if it's small that you couldn't plant it. You just have to be a lot more watching and careful with it so that it will come up to a point where it will get beyond the deer's reach.
One thing I found for trees, I know I'm not part of this talk, but I get very depressed when I think about how long it's going to take for me to actually see the tree at full maturity.
Right.
And so one thing we did at Amazing Discoveries here is we have trees along the driveway, and they are at least 5 years old before we planted them, because then you can get fruit right away. They're a little bit stronger.
Yeah.
So I prefer
they're
that.
easier to deal with than the little trees.
So,
The little ones are a lot cheaper,
right.
but you're not getting that strong foundation right away.
Yeah, so if you buy trees, it's okay to invest a little bit more. It'll really pay off in the end. But if you grow trees yourself from seed, which you can do, and you graft them, that's all good. Then you just plant them, and you have to watch a lot more about them the first couple of years. So, yeah.
Do you want to have a word of prayer while we close?
Sure, I can pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for this wonderful day you have given once again. Thank you for the message you have for us about growing food in the garden, getting our hands dirty, and learning from you. Thank you, Lord, that we still have the ability to grow food in gardens freely, and that we can buy seed and that we can buy tools. Lord, please bless us as we go out and put these things that we have learned into practice. Help us to depend on you and to ask you for guidance and help in everything we do. And thank you, Lord, that you let the garden grow so well that we can even share with others and bless others as well. Please bless all the efforts in growing food and gardening for everyone that's present here and that's watching online. And please help us to remember that you're the one that provides for us. I thank you and I praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
This presentation was filmed at our 2022 camp meeting on site in British Columbia. If you would like to join for the next camp meeting, visit our events page for details. events.amazingdiscoveries.org